I never thought I'd be the guy telling a story like this, but here I am. I'm Mike, 38 years old, and I've been married to Emily for 8 years. No kids. We talked about it once or twice, but it never seemed like the right time. Too busy, too many plans. You know how life gets. We spent most of our time on trips, parties, holidays with family. It was the thing that kept us going. Those vacations were always a chance to unwind, but now I realize they were also where everything started to fall apart. My brother Dan is only a couple of years younger than me. We've always been close. We grew up together, shared everything. Sports, friends, hell, even a few girlfriends back in the day. He's the easygoing type, the kind of guy everyone likes, and maybe that's what made it so hard for me to see what was happening right under my nose. It all began about a year ago when our family decided to take this annual summer trip to the lake. My parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone was there, including Dan and Emily. It was supposed to be a time to relax, but looking back, it was more than that for the two of them. It was where they started getting close. Too close. I'd noticed little things. Dan and Emily laughing together at the breakfast table, sitting next to each other at the bonfire. At the time, I thought it was harmless. My wife and my brother being friendly, right? What's wrong with that? But then things started to feel off. Emily would glance at her phone, giggling at texts late at night, and when I asked, she'd brush it off like it was nothing. "Just Dan," she'd say, as if that explained everything. The worst part is, I trusted her. I trusted both of them. Why wouldn't I? We were family. We were supposed to have each other's backs. But things kept escalating after that summer trip. Emily started finding excuses to visit Dan more. She'd claim she needed his help with something, moving furniture, fixing something in the house. And I, like the fool I was, didn't think twice. I mean, she had never given me a reason to doubt her. I didn't suspect a damn thing. Until last week. It was a Friday, and I'd come home early from work. Emily wasn't home, and neither was Dan. He'd been staying with us for a while, said he needed a break from his place, a change of scenery. I didn't mind. Why would I? But the house was empty, and for the first time, I had this nagging feeling in my gut. Something wasn't right. I sat down in the living room and waited. Hours passed. Emily finally came home around midnight, looking flushed, hair a mess. She tried to play it off like she had been out with friends, but her lies were starting to crack. I didn't push it that night, but I knew. Deep down, I knew. The next day, I decided to check her phone, something I'd never done before. It felt wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling. And there it was. Texts between her and Dan. Messages full of inside jokes, flirtation, plans to meet up. The ones that stung the most were the ones where she told him she couldn't wait to see him, that she missed him. That was my wife, talking to my brother like that. I threw the phone down, feeling sick to my stomach. I hadn't caught them in the act, yet. But I knew. The betrayal was clear as day. I didn't confront her right away. I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do. My brother, my own blood, had been sleeping with my wife. I just didn't know how long it had been going on. And the worst part? I was about to find out. That Sunday started out like any other. Emily was making breakfast, acting like everything was fine. It was the way she smiled at me, the way she touched my arm. It was all fake, a cover-up. But I played along, pretending I didn't know what I knew. I had to, for a little longer. I needed proof. Dan wasn't around, said he'd be out all day, which was typical for him lately. "I've got some errands to run," he'd say. But we both knew that was bullshit. I wasn't sure where he was, but I had a gut feeling it wasn't far. By mid-afternoon, Emily said she was going out for a bit. "Just running a few things to the store," she told me, giving me a kiss on the cheek before she left. The kiss felt cold, empty. I watched her get in her car and pull out of the driveway, my hands clenched into fists. I knew something was up, so I decided to follow her. I kept my distance, far enough behind so she wouldn't notice, but close enough to see where she was going. She wasn't heading toward the store. That much was clear. Instead, she turned down a street that led right back toward our house. Only she didn't go home. She drove straight to Dan's apartment. My heart was pounding in my chest as I parked a couple of blocks away. I couldn't believe what I was about to do, but I had to know. I had to see it with my own eyes. I walked quietly up to his place, staying low, creeping around the side of the building. His bedroom window was slightly open, and that's when I heard it, the sound of them laughing. It was her laugh, the same laugh she used to have with me. But now it was with him. I felt like I was going to be sick. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe they were just talking. Maybe this wasn't what I thought it was. But then I heard something else. Moaning. It was unmistakable. I froze. My stomach twisted into knots. My wife was inside that apartment having sex with my brother. I wanted to storm in there right then, kick the door down and drag him out. But something stopped me. Instead, I quietly circled around to the front door. And that's when I saw it. The door wasn't fully shut. It was slightly ajar, like they hadn't even bothered to lock it. I pushed it open just a crack, and that's when I saw them. Emily was handcuffed to the bed, completely naked, and Dan was on top of her just as naked as she was. They didn't even notice me standing there, too wrapped up in each other to care. My blood was boiling, my hands shaking as I watched my brother screw my wife right there in his bedroom, my wife in my brother's bed. I must have made some kind of noise because suddenly they both froze. Emily's head snapped toward the door, and her eyes went wide when she saw me standing there. She screamed, "Mike!" Oh my God, it's not what it looks like. But we both knew that was a lie. She started thrashing in the handcuffs, trying to cover herself up, but there was nothing she could do. Dan was frozen too, like he couldn't believe he'd been caught. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I just stood there staring at them, my entire world shattered. Then, as if her words weren't enough, Emily started going hysterical. "It's not what you think, Mike. He came on to me. I didn't mean for this to happen. It's his fault." She was screaming, accusing Dan, like I'd actually believe it was all him. She was trying to lie her way out of it, but it was pathetic. I looked right at Dan, who had his hands in the air like some kind of criminal caught in the act. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The guilt was written all over his face. "Get out," I finally said, my voice low but firm. "Both of you." Emily kept screaming, making excuses, still trying to convince me that what I saw wasn't what it was. But I didn't care anymore. I was done. I don't know how long I stood there staring at them. Time felt like it had stopped. Emily was still hysterical, screaming about how it wasn't her fault, how she hadn't meant for any of it to happen. Dan just sat there on the edge of the bed, trying to hide himself, not saying a damn thing. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't say anything else. I turned and walked out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I needed air. I needed space. Hell, I needed to get as far away from them as possible before I did something I'd regret. My mind was racing, my hands shaking as I got into my car and just sat there, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. How the hell could they do this to me? My own brother, my wife, together. I mean, I knew something was wrong, but to actually see it like that, it felt like a punch straight to the gut. No, worse. It felt like my whole world had been ripped out from under me. I kept replaying the scene in my head. Emily in those handcuffs, Dan all over her. It was burned into my brain. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. I didn't know where to go or what to do. All I knew was I couldn't go back home. Not yet. Not while they were still there. Eventually, I ended up in some empty parking lot just sitting there, staring at nothing. That's when my phone started buzzing. Emily. Of course, it was her. I watched it light up with her name again and again, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. What the hell was I supposed to say? What was she going to say? More lies, no doubt. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, letting it ring itself out. After a while, the calls stopped. Then came the texts. They were worse. "Mike, please come back. We need to talk." "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake. Dan meant nothing to me. Each one made my blood boil a little more. I knew what I had to do. There was no coming back from this. No conversation was going to fix what they had broken. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me any longer. She'd shown me exactly who she was. Hours passed before I finally drove back home. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, except for the porch light that I always left on. I wondered if she was still inside, waiting for me, if Dan had come back here with her. I walked through the front door and was immediately hit with a wave of silence. No sign of Emily, no sign of Dan. Thank God. I headed straight for the bedroom. It was funny, really. That bed we had shared for so many years. It felt like a stranger's bed now. It felt like a place I didn't belong anymore. I couldn't even look at it without thinking of what I'd just seen. That's when I made my decision. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started packing. Shirts, pants, whatever I could fit in the bag. I was done. I wasn't going to wait around for Emily to come home with more excuses, more lies. She could have the house, the bed, all of it. None of it mattered anymore. I threw the suitcase into the car and headed to the one place I knew I could think, my buddy Sam's. He'd been my best friend since high school, the only person I could trust right now. I drove over without even calling, and when I got there, I knocked on the door feeling like a complete mess. Sam opened the door and took one look at me. "Mike? What the hell, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't have the energy to explain it all right then. "I need to crash here for a while," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'll explain later." Sam didn't ask questions. He just nodded, stepping aside to let me in. "Yeah, man. Whatever you need." I crashed on his couch that night, staring up at the ceiling, wondering how my life had come to this. I wasn't angry anymore. I was numb. Completely numb. But I knew one thing for sure. I was done with Emily. Done with Dan. There was no going back now. Tomorrow I was filing for divorce. The next morning, I woke up on Sam's couch with the sun creeping through the blinds, but I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Everything from the day before came rushing back like a flood, hitting me all over again. Emily. Dan. The whole disgusting mess. For a few seconds I thought maybe it was just a nightmare. But no. This was my reality now. Sam wandered into the living room, looking half asleep but concerned. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up a cup. "Yeah, thanks," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. I could barely focus. We sat in silence for a while, me staring at the floor, Sam waiting for me to speak. Eventually, I told him everything. From the way Emily and Dan had been acting all weird to how I caught them in his apartment, and finally, how she was handcuffed to the damn bed like it was some joke. I could barely get the words out without feeling sick all over again. Sam didn't say anything for a minute. He just shook his head, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "Man, I knew something was off with her, but I didn't think—" He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Your own brother? That's messed up." "You're telling me," I replied, my voice flat. "I'm filing for divorce today." Sam nodded. "Yeah, you've got to. There's no fixing this." There wasn't. I knew that now. No apology, no explanation. Nothing was going to make this right. Emily had made her choice, and so had Dan. As far as I was concerned, they could both rot together. I finished my coffee and got up, feeling more determined than I had in the last 24 hours. "I'm going to head to the lawyer's office," I told Sam. "Thanks for letting me crash here." "Anytime, man. You need anything, you call me, all right?" Sam gave me a pat on the back, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew this wasn't something that was just going to blow over. I did too. I left his place and drove straight to a divorce attorney's office. I didn't care about the details right then. I just wanted out. The lawyer was a straight-talking guy. He listened to what I had to say, and when I mentioned my wife cheating on me with my brother, his eyebrows shot up. He didn't say much, just nodded like he'd heard worse. But I could tell it wasn't every day someone walked in with a story like mine. After we went over the basics of what I wanted, divorce, no reconciliation, he told me it could be a quick process, given that we didn't have any kids. That was the one relief in all of this. No kids. At least I wouldn't have to drag a child through the mud with us. By the time I left the lawyer's office, it felt like a weight had lifted off me. Not completely, but enough to breathe again. I had made my decision. This was the first step toward getting my life back. Emily could keep the house, the bed, the lies. I didn't want any of it anymore. I just wanted my freedom. I got back in my car and stared at my phone, seeing more missed calls from Emily. She hadn't stopped texting either. The same pathetic apologies, the same excuses, begging me to talk to her. But I didn't feel like talking. Not yet. She was going to find out soon enough when the papers hit her doorstep. Instead, I called Dan. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I had to hear it from him. Maybe I needed to hear him admit it. Or maybe I just wanted to hear his voice when he realized he had lost his brother for good. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Mike?" His voice was shaky, like he already knew why I was calling. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, cutting straight to the point. "And you? You're dead to me." There was silence on the other end for a long time. "Mike, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know what came over me. Please, you have to believe me." "I don't," I snapped, my anger rising. "I don't believe a word out of your mouth anymore. You're my brother, Dan. My brother. And you were screwing my wife behind my back. I know I messed up. I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry." But his apology meant nothing to me now. "You're not my brother anymore. As far as I'm concerned, you're nothing." I hung up before he could say another word, feeling like I had closed one door in my life that was never going to open again. When I got back to Sam's place that evening, I felt drained. But for the first time in a long time, I also felt ready to move on, ready to let them both go. Emily and Dan could have each other. I didn't care anymore. That night I sat on Sam's couch staring at the TV, though I wasn't really watching it. My mind was elsewhere, running through every memory of Emily and Dan that now felt tainted. I thought about the family holidays, the cookouts, the trips. It was all a lie. I couldn't figure out how long this had been going on, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized it didn't even matter. It was done. They were done. Sam had gone out for the night, giving me some space, so I was alone with my thoughts, which was the last thing I needed. My phone buzzed again. Emily. Another text. But this one was different. "We need to talk. I'm coming over." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling my stomach twist. I hadn't planned on seeing her so soon. In fact, I didn't want to see her at all. Not until the divorce was underway. But I knew if I didn't let her talk now, she'd just keep pushing, keep making this harder than it needed to be. I texted back, telling her to meet me at Sam's. If she wanted to talk, we'd talk. But it wasn't going to change anything. About an hour later, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, and there she was. Emily, looking worse than I'd ever seen her. Her eyes were red, her hair a mess, and she had this look of desperation plastered across her face. The woman who used to be so put together now looked like she was barely holding herself up. "Mike," she whispered, stepping inside. "Please, we need to talk." I didn't want to let her in, but I did. I stepped aside, letting her walk into the living room where we had spent so many nights together with Sam and friends, laughing, joking, before everything fell apart. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for me to say something. But I stayed silent. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "Mike, I'm so sorry," she started, sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands shaking. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but it wasn't what you think." That made me laugh. It was bitter, cold, but I couldn't help it. "It wasn't what I think?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I saw you, Emily. I saw you with Dan. You were in his bed, handcuffed to it. What exactly do you think I'm misunderstanding here?" She winced, her face crumbling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I mean, yes, we were together, but I didn't want it to happen. It just—" She struggled for words, like she was trying to come up with the right excuse, but there wasn't one. It just happened, Mike. I don't know how. I shook my head. You don't know how? Really? You've been sneaking around with my brother and you're going to stand here and tell me it just happened? Her face flushed with guilt, and she looked down at her hands. I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe me, Mike. I never wanted this to happen. You never wanted this to happen. I scoffed. You wanted him. You wanted whatever thrill you were getting from cheating on me with my brother. Don't pretend this was an accident. It wasn't. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head frantically. No, it wasn't like that. Dan came on to me. I was weak. I was confused, and I let it get out of hand. But I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe me. I just stared at her, feeling nothing but cold, bitter anger. I'd heard enough. The truth was clear, and no amount of her crying or blaming Dan was going to change what I had seen with my own eyes. I'm filing for divorce, Emily, I said, cutting her off. I already talked to the lawyer. This is over. Her face crumbled completely and she broke down, sobbing into her hands. No, Mike, please don't. I can fix this. We can fix this. Please, don't throw everything away because of one mistake. One mistake? I spat, feeling my blood boil. This wasn't a mistake, Emily. It was a choice. You chose to sleep with my brother. You chose to lie to me. You've been doing it for God knows how long, and now you want to pretend it didn't mean anything? That it's all just one big mistake? We're done. She reached out, grabbing my arm, desperation in her eyes. Please, Mike, I love you. I swear I'll never see Dan again. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Just don't leave me. I pulled my arm away, stepping back from her. You already left me, Emily. You left me the moment you decided to be with Dan. There's nothing left here. The room fell into silence, broken only by the sound of her quiet sobs. I didn't feel anything for her anymore. Not pity, not love, not even anger. Just emptiness. I'll send you the divorce papers when they're ready, I said, turning toward the door. You can take the house. I don't want it. She didn't respond, just kept crying into her hands. I walked out the door, leaving her there in the wreckage of what she had created. And just like that, it was over. I drove away from Sam's house that night, feeling like I had nothing left. The numbness had taken over completely. Emily's tears, her pleading, none of it mattered anymore. All I could see when I closed my eyes was her with Dan, in his bed, in those handcuffs. Her cries of, I love you, meant nothing now. It was all too late. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove, mindlessly, until I found myself back at our house. Her house now. It was dark inside, no lights on, and for a second, I thought maybe she'd left. But her car was still in the driveway. She was probably in bed, crying herself to sleep, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I didn't want to be there. The house felt haunted, filled with memories of a life I thought was real but was nothing but lies. I grabbed the last of my things from the closet, whatever clothes I hadn't packed yet, and threw them into a bag. I didn't need much, just enough to get by until I figured out where I was going to stay long term. I looked around the bedroom one last time. That bed. I couldn't even stand to look at it. The thought of them in here together made me want to smash everything in sight. But I didn't. Instead, I just left. I spent the next few days in limbo, crashing at Sam's place, ignoring Emily's calls and texts. I went through the motions, putting one foot in front of the other, getting through the day. The divorce was moving forward, and I knew it would only be a matter of time before the papers were served to her. Sam tried to keep me distracted, but it didn't matter what we did. Drinks at the bar, late-night TV, shooting hoops in the driveway, it all felt hollow. Everything did. My life had become this endless loop of pretending things were fine when they were anything but. I hadn't even told my parents yet, though I knew I couldn't put that off much longer. They'd have to know eventually. A week later, the papers were ready. I went to the lawyer's office to sign them, feeling strangely calm about the whole thing. The hardest part was over. There was no going back now. As I sat there with the lawyer, signing my name on the dotted line, my mind drifted back to Dan. I hadn't spoken to him since I called him after I found out. I hadn't seen him either. Part of me wondered if he was waiting for me to cool off, if he thought I'd forgive him eventually. But I knew better. There was no forgiving this. Family didn't mean anything when it was stained by betrayal. Dan was dead to me, and that wasn't going to change. Once the papers were signed, the lawyer assured me Emily would be served within the next few days. I nodded, not really caring about the specifics. I just wanted it over. I wanted her out of my life, and I wanted to forget everything that had happened. But I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. I left the lawyer's office and headed back to Sam's, ready to settle into my routine of avoiding everything. But when I pulled up to the driveway, there was a car I hadn't seen in years. My parents' car. I froze, my heart sinking. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to explain everything to them. But there was no turning back now. I parked and slowly made my way inside, bracing myself for what was about to come. Inside, I found my parents sitting with Sam at the kitchen table, the three of them deep in conversation. My mom looked up the moment I walked in, her face softening with worry. "Mike, we need to talk," she said gently. I sighed, dropping my bag by the door. "Yeah, I figured." I sat down across from them, trying to prepare myself for the inevitable questions. My dad leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "We ran into Dan," he said slowly. "He told us what happened." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Dan. Of course, he'd gone crying to them first, trying to spin his side of the story. I clenched my fists, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "He told you?" I asked, my voice tight. My mom nodded, her eyes full of sympathy. "He told us about Emily, about what happened between them." I couldn't even look at her. "Did he tell you why?" My dad cleared his throat, his voice steady but strained. "He didn't explain much, just that it happened and he regrets it. He said he's been trying to reach you." I scoffed. "Yeah, I bet he has." My mom reached across the table, resting her hand on mine. "Mike, we know this is horrible. I can't even imagine what you're feeling right now. But Dan's still your brother. This doesn't have to be the end of everything." Her words made my stomach turn. The betrayal was still so fresh, and the last thing I wanted to hear was some plea to forgive Dan. How could she even ask that of me? I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. "Mom, you don't get it. It's over. Dan's dead to me." "But he's family," she said softly, her voice pleading. "Family makes mistakes, Mike, and I'm not saying what he did was right, but—" "It wasn't a mistake," I cut her off, my voice hard. "It was a choice. He chose to sleep with my wife. He chose to betray me, and now I'm choosing to cut him out of my life." My dad let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "Mike, I understand you're angry, but we can't just throw away family." "I'm not throwing anything away," I snapped, feeling my frustration boil over. "Dan did that. He's the one who threw away everything when he decided to screw my wife. And if you think I'm going to sit here and act like everything's fine just because we're family, you're wrong." The room fell into silence, thick with tension. My mom looked like she wanted to cry, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. I had my own pain to deal with, and I wasn't going to let anyone guilt me into forgiving Dan for what he'd done. "I'm filing for divorce," I said finally, breaking the silence. "It's already in motion, and as for Dan, he can do whatever he wants. But I'm done with him." The silence that followed my words felt heavy, like the air in the room had thickened. My mom was staring at me with those wide, tear-filled eyes, but I wasn't budging. I wasn't going to let her convince me to forgive Dan just because we shared the same blood. That didn't mean anything anymore. My dad spoke first, his voice low and tired. "Mike, I get it. I really do. But we've seen what happens when families fall apart over something like this. It leaves scars. You don't have to forgive him today or even tomorrow, but cutting him out of your life for good? That's not the answer." I stared at him, trying to hold back the rage bubbling up inside me. "And what's the answer, Dad? Pretend like nothing happened? Pretend like I didn't walk in on my own brother screwing my wife? I shook my head. You don't get it. You can't fix this. No one can. Sam, who had been quiet this whole time, finally spoke up. Look, guys, maybe we should just give Mike some space. This is still fresh, and you can't expect him to figure everything out right now. I appreciated him trying to step in, but the damage was already done. My mom was still looking at me like I'd ripped her heart out, and I was feeling like the bad guy for not forgiving Dan. But there was nothing left to forgive. I stood up, feeling like I was about to explode. I need some air, I muttered, heading for the door before they could stop me. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I walked aimlessly down the street, my thoughts racing. Everything was swirling around in my head. Emily's lies, Dan's betrayal, my parents acting like this was something we could just get over. How could they not understand how broken I felt? How ruined everything was? I ended up at the park a few blocks away, sitting down on a bench. The cold metal of the seat seeped through my jacket, but I didn't care. I just needed to be alone, away from everyone and everything. I sat there for a long time, watching the world go by, people walking their dogs, kids playing on the swings. Life was still moving for everyone else, but mine had come to a screeching halt. How was I supposed to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered like this? I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, before my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting another message from Emily or Dan, but it was neither. It was from my dad. We're heading home. If you need anything, call us. We love you. I didn't respond. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? I shoved the phone back into my pocket and leaned back on the bench, staring up at the gray sky. For a moment, I thought about driving to Dan's place, showing up at his door and letting all my anger out, telling him exactly what he'd done face to face. But what would that accomplish? He already knew. He knew what he'd done, and there was no fixing it. I stayed at the park until the sun started to set, the cold creeping deeper into my bones. I knew I had to go back eventually, but the idea of facing my parents again, of hearing them try to defend Dan, was more than I could handle. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. When I finally got back to Sam's, it was quiet. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the TV in the living room. Sam was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels aimlessly, a beer in his hand. "Hey," he said, glancing up when I walked in. "Your folks just left." "Yeah, I figured." I dropped my jacket by the door and sank onto the couch next to him. I felt drained, like all the fight had gone out of me. "Thanks for, I don't know, trying to help." Sam nodded, taking a swig of his beer. "You know I've got your back, man. Always." He paused, glancing at me. "So, what's next?" "Divorce," I said simply, leaning back into the couch. "Once the papers are served, that's it. I'm done." Sam was quiet for a minute, like he was trying to figure out what to say. "And Dan?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to beat the crap out of him, but another part of me just doesn't care anymore. He's not my problem." Sam nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that." We sat there in silence for a while, the TV flickering in the background, neither of us really watching it. I was still numb, still trying to process everything that had happened. But at least now I had a plan, a way forward, even if it was going to be messy and painful. The next day, the divorce papers were sent to Emily. I got the notification from the lawyer, and as soon as I saw it, I felt lighter. Like the weight of it all was finally starting to lift, even just a little. Emily didn't call me. She didn't text. I think she finally understood that this was it, that I wasn't coming back. Dan, though, he wasn't done. 2 days after the papers were served, he showed up at Sam's place. I wasn't expecting him. I had been sitting in the kitchen, drinking my coffee, when the doorbell rang. I went to answer it, and there he was, standing on the doorstep, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Mike," he started, his voice low and shaky. "Can we talk?" I stared at him, not sure if I wanted to slam the door in his face or hear him out. "There's nothing to talk about." "Please," he said, his eyes desperate. "Just 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." I didn't move, just stood there, staring at him. He looked like hell, eyes bloodshot, clothes wrinkled, like he hadn't showered in days. This wasn't the Dan I knew. But then again, I didn't know him anymore, did I? "Fine," I muttered, stepping aside. 5 minutes. Dan stepped into the house, and as I shut the door behind him, I could feel the old rage bubbling up inside me. I had told myself I was done with him, but seeing him there standing in front of me, all that anger I thought I'd buried started clawing its way back to the surface. He stood there awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes avoiding mine. "I'm sorry, Mike," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up. I know I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I crossed my arms, leaning against the kitchen counter, staring at him. "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, the sarcasm dripping from my voice. "You mean you accidentally ended up in bed with my wife? Come on, Dan, just say what you really mean. You wanted her and you took her. End of story." His face fell, and he looked like a kicked puppy. "It wasn't like that, Mike, I swear. It just got out of control. It started after one of those family trips, you know? I don't know what came over me, but she kept coming around and you couldn't resist?" I finished for him, my voice cold. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. But here's the thing, Dan. You didn't just betray me. You took everything I thought I could trust and ripped it apart." "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to fix this. I'll do anything, Mike. Just tell me what to do." I shook my head, disgusted. "There's nothing you can do. You can't undo this. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but I cut him off. "We're done, Dan. I don't want to hear from you again. Don't show up here. Don't call me. You and Emily can have each other. You deserve each other." His face went pale, and for a moment I thought he might start crying. But I didn't care. I was done with his apologies, done with his guilt. None of it mattered anymore. "I don't want her," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I never did. I made a mistake, Mike. Please just don't shut me out." "You did that yourself," I said, my voice steady. "Now get out." Dan stood there for a few seconds longer, like he wanted to say more, but he must have realized it was pointless. He turned slowly, heading for the door without another word. I watched him go, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a long breath. I felt exhausted, drained from everything, but I also felt a new kind of clarity. Dan was out of my life now, and so was Emily. For the next few weeks, things escalated quickly between me and Emily. The divorce papers were in motion, but she wasn't taking it well. At first, she stayed quiet, but then the texts started again. Long, rambling messages begging for another chance, promising that she would never speak to Dan again, that she'd do anything to fix this. But I wasn't interested in fixing anything. I ignored her as best I could, but it was like she couldn't stop. She showed up at Sam's place twice, banging on the door, screaming at me to let her in. The first time, I didn't answer. The second time, Sam had to physically drag her away, telling her to leave before the cops got involved. Emily wasn't the same woman I had married. The desperation had taken over completely, and every time I saw her or heard from her, she seemed more unhinged. The lies got worse too. She started telling people that I was abandoning her, that I was leaving her with nothing. She was painting herself as the victim, trying to turn the situation into something where she could win sympathy. One night, I got a call from my mom, her voice trembling with worry. "Mike, what's going on? Emily's been saying some pretty awful things. Is it true? Are you really leaving her with nothing?" I could feel the blood rushing to my head. "She's lying," I said flatly. "Don't listen to anything she says." My mom was quiet for a moment. "I just don't understand how it got to this point. It feels like everything is falling apart." "Because it is, Mom. I said, my voice harsh. It's over. Emily's not who you think she is. Just stay out of it. I hung up before she could ask more questions. Emily was spiraling, trying to drag everyone down with her, but I wasn't going to let her get to me. She was trying to play the victim, but I knew the truth. And soon, everyone else would too. The turning point came one night, about a month after the papers were served. I was lying in bed at Sam's place, scrolling through my phone, when I got a message from Emily. I almost ignored it, but something in me clicked. I opened the message, and there it was, a picture of her, half naked, her arms crossed over her chest. The caption below it read, "Remember what you're giving up." I stared at the picture, my stomach turning. That was it. That was the last straw. Emily wasn't going to leave me alone, and she wasn't going to stop trying to manipulate me. She thought she could keep playing games even now, but I was done playing. I was going to get my revenge. Over the next few days, I started planning. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, not after everything she'd done. The lies, the betrayal, the manipulation. She thought she could control me, but she was wrong. I waited until the right moment. I knew she was still seeing Dan behind the scenes, despite all her claims of wanting to fix things with me. So I started gathering proof. It wasn't hard. Dan was sloppy and Emily wasn't much better. I got pictures, texts, even some video footage from one of the times they met up. It was all I needed to ruin them both. Once I had everything, I made my move. I'd spent weeks letting Emily think she was still in control, still playing her games, but deep down, I was waiting. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and it was going to hit her like a train. After I'd gathered all the evidence, pictures of her and Dan sneaking around, messages that proved their affair hadn't stopped even after I'd caught them, I knew it was time to strike. Emily had no idea I had this kind of leverage. She was still trying to make herself look like the victim to everyone we knew, and it made my blood boil every time someone would call or message me saying they'd heard Emily's side of the story. I wasn't going to let her drag my name through the mud while she played innocent. The night it all came together was perfect. I had every piece of proof I needed to destroy them both. I created a folder, videos, pictures, screenshots, everything. Then I crafted a message and sent it to everyone who mattered. My parents, her family, our friends, hell, even Dan's boss got a copy. I wasn't leaving any stone unturned. The subject line read, "The truth about Emily and Dan." I hit send and felt a calm wash over me. It was all out there now. There was no going back. Whatever happened next, I was ready. The fallout was immediate. My phone blew up with messages and calls, people shocked at what they were seeing. Emily's lies were laid bare for everyone to see. I didn't respond to any of the messages. This wasn't about explaining myself. I'd let the proof speak for itself. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was Emily. I wasn't planning on answering, but something in me wanted to hear the panic in her voice. I picked up, and sure enough, she was hysterical. "Mike, what the hell did you do?" she screamed. "Why would you send that to everyone? You're ruining my life." "Your life was ruined the second you decided to sleep with my brother," I said coldly. "I just made sure everyone knew the truth." "You had no right," she yelled, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, okay? I was trying to fix things, and now you've made it impossible." I laughed bitterly. "Fix things? You weren't trying to fix anything. You were still seeing Dan, still lying to me, to everyone. You're just mad that you finally got caught." There was silence on the other end for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, more controlled. "Mike, you can't undo this. People are going to hate you for what you did." "Good," I replied, my voice calm. "I don't care what people think of me anymore. You, Dan, you both made your bed and now you're going to lie in it." She didn't say anything for a few moments, just breathing heavily into the phone. "You're a bastard," she finally spat. "You think you're so righteous, but you're just as messed up as I am." I didn't even bother replying. I hung up and turned off my phone, feeling the last bit of weight lift off my chest. Emily was spiraling, and I wasn't going to let her pull me down with her. I poured myself a drink, sitting down in Sam's living room, feeling more at peace than I had in months. I knew Emily was going to keep trying to fight, but she didn't have any power over me anymore. I had taken back control, and whatever came next, I was ready for it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Sam knocking on my door. "Dude, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice barely containing his shock. "What?" I asked, groggy from the night before. "Emily. She's gone full nuclear. She's telling everyone you faked the evidence, that you're trying to ruin her because she left you for Dan." I blinked at him, half surprised, but mostly just tired. "Of course she is," I muttered. What did I expect? But Sam shook his head. "No, Mike, you don't get it. She's losing it. She showed up at your parents' house last night, screaming at them, trying to convince them it's all a lie. They had to call the cops to get her to leave." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Emily was unraveling faster than I expected. I hadn't thought she'd go this far, but now it was clear. She was desperate. "I don't care what she does anymore," I said, standing up. "Let her scream, let her burn everything down, it doesn't matter." But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. Emily wasn't the kind of person to go down without a fight. And if she was willing to show up at my parents' house, then who knew what she'd do next? Later that day, I got a call from my lawyer. "Mike, we need to talk. Emily's filed a restraining order against you." "What?" I said, completely thrown off. "She's claiming you're harassing her, stalking her, and trying to destroy her reputation. She's pulling out all the stops, man." I laughed bitterly. Of course she was. This was Emily's last desperate attempt to paint herself as the victim. I could see it all clearly now. She'd tell everyone I was the crazy, jealous ex-husband trying to ruin her life because she moved on with Dan. But she wasn't going to win. Emily filing the restraining order was her last attempt to regain control, but it didn't scare me. It just showed how desperate she'd become. She was trying to make me look like the villain in a story where she had already burned everything down. I met with my lawyer and prepared my response. The evidence I had, the texts, the photos, the videos, was undeniable. No one was going to believe her once they saw the truth, and I had already made sure enough people knew the real story. Still, it was exhausting, seeing her flail in every direction to save herself. Her life was unraveling fast, and she was trying to take me down with her. A few days after the restraining order mess started, I got a call from my lawyer again. This time he sounded almost relieved. "Mike, it's over," he said. "Emily's lawyer just called. She's dropping everything. The restraining order, the divorce fight. It's all done. She's agreed to sign the papers as they are." I sat there stunned. Why? She's backed into a corner. She knows she's lost. And just like that, it was over. No more fighting, no more drama. Emily had realized she couldn't win, and now she was finally giving up. I could feel the weight lift off my shoulders as the reality of it sank in. 2 weeks later, I stood in my lawyer's office signing the final divorce papers. Emily hadn't shown up. She had probably realized it was easier to disappear than to keep fighting a battle she knew she'd lose. As I walked out of the office, I felt free for the first time in months. Emily and Dan were out of my life for good. They could do whatever they wanted now. I didn't care. I got in my car, looked at the divorce papers on the passenger seat, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Revenge was sweet, but moving on was even better.